The lights in the briefing room flickered softly as the sea outside the carrier still held its dark grip on the morning. Steam curled from untouched coffee mugs while 20 men in flight suits shuffled papers, made half-jokes, and waited for orders. They were the best, and they knew it every shoulder, carrying the swagger of combat hours and call signs earned in the sky. Commander Blake Reynolds stood at the front, a veteran with sharp edges and sharper opinions, laying out the flight map for their next mission. His tone was clipped, his confidence absolute, barely masking the routine nature of what he thought was just another operation. That was when the door creaked open and silence spread faster than an alarm. A woman stepped through uniform standard, but oddly stripped of the usual flight patches that told war stories without words. No call sign on her chest, no theater tags or combat stripes, just a clean suit and a small folder tucked under one arm like she had wandered in from admin. The tension didn't break. It shifted. A few of the men exchanged quick glances, smirks forming before a single word was spoken. Someone in the back whispered something under his breath, and laughter bubbled up from 2 rows, the kind that had nothing to do with humor. Reynolds didn't bother to make eye contact, just nodded at the last row. "Captain, take a seat in the back. We're in the middle of the Shadowfall brief." She moved without a word, unhurried, her expression unreadable. From her seat, she studied the wall of maps and data Reynolds had prepared. She said nothing, took no notes, just watched. The only visible mark on her entire body was a faded scar along the side of her neck, half hidden by her collar. No one asked how she got it. No one cared yet. They had already decided what she was. A name on a transfer form. A quota. A woman in a man's war. But no one noticed the way her eyes narrowed slightly when the map showed the Widowmaker Pass. They didn't yet understand who had just walked into their room. Part 1. Ava, the Quiet Storm. Ava Lawson didn't look like someone who had spent a lifetime in combat zones. She sat with her back straight, her hands steady, and her gaze calm as if nothing in the room could shake her. Her flight suit was regulation but unremarkable plain, and without the splashy insignias most pilots wore like trophies. There was no patch to say where she'd been, no symbol to show what she'd done, only her name stitched neatly above her heart, and a thin burn scar trailing from her collarbone to just under her jaw. She had earned that scar in silence in the heat of a burning cockpit half a world away. It had taken days before a team reached her wreckage hidden in a mountain pass with barely enough food and a broken comm system she rebuilt from scraps. Her reward was survival, and the choice to disappear behind the veil of special operations. Ava never chased medals or press briefings. She hated the sound of applause, hated the way people changed once they learned what she had done. She chose the quiet route. She flew missions no one talked about and came home to quiet rooms, logbooks, and the distant hum of a life no one knew how to ask about. Even now, seated among the noise and ego of the Jolly Rogers, she didn't fidget or flinch. She didn't care who spoke over her or what they assumed. She had been underestimated before, and it had never changed the way she flew. There was a strength in her silence. Not the brittle kind that cracks when pushed, but the calm, immovable kind that comes from knowing who you are and what you've seen. Ava had flown through skies laced with missiles and fire. She had walked out of valleys others didn't return from. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. That phase of her life had ended the day she pulled herself from twisted metal with her hands blistered and lungs filled with smoke. Since then, she had let her work speak, let her silence grow roots, let people think what they would. Ava had learned early that the loudest people in the room often knew the least, and she had made peace with that. She didn't need them to believe her yet, because soon enough they would. Part 2. The Fighter Pilot Boys Club. The Jolly Roger Squadron operated like a private club where reputation was currency and rank only mattered if it came with stories to back it up. Everyone in that room had flown through storms, fire, and fury, and they carried that pride like a second uniform. They cracked jokes, during briefings mocked near-death experiences like bar talk and spoken shorthand only earned through shared chaos. Commander Reynolds ruled the space with a calm authority that came less from charisma and more from accumulated survival. He had flown for 2 decades and wore his seniority like armor. No one questioned him because no one ever needed to. The squadron had an unspoken rhythm. They talked over each other but knew when to stop. They insulted and respected in the same breath. Outsiders weren't so much excluded as simply invisible. So, When Ava walked in, they didn't see her. They saw what they assumed she was: a quota check. A desk officer looking for her place in a combat room where blood smoke and fear had already baptized the rest of them. No one asked her name twice. No one wondered what she might bring. Instead, they watched her like a misplaced file someone had accidentally stapled to their orders. Lieutenant Carter made a crack about commercial pilots that got a few laughs. Mills added a joke about his sister flying cargo planes. It didn't even feel cruel to them. Just another layer of pilot banter passed down through generations of cockpits. No one meant to be malicious. They were just comfortable, and comfort in that room meant making sure everyone knew where they stood. Ava, in their eyes, stood on the outside. Even Reynolds, who should have known better, treated her like a formality sent from Washington. He acknowledged her with a nod, gave her a seat in the back, and continued the mission brief as if her presence was little more than a paper trail. The air was thick with something unspoken. Not hate. Not even disdain. Just the lazy condescension of men who had never been told they weren't the center of the story. They didn't need to be hostile to make someone feel unwelcome. All it took was a shared assumption and a few sideways glances, and in that room, those spread like wildfire. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't try to interrupt or defend her place. She just sat, listened, and let the weight of their assumptions hang in the air like smoke that hadn't found the fire yet. But the fire was coming, and none of them were ready for it. Part 3. Ava challenges the plan. Sub. Part 3.1. Tactical tension. As the mission briefing wore on, Ava's eyes stayed locked on the projected maps. She studied the outlined route through Widowmaker Pass, lips pressed in a thin line. The path Reynolds had chosen was tight, aggressive, and overconfident. She flipped open her folder and jotted a small note. No hesitation, no pause, just a quiet certainty that something in the plan didn't sit right. When Reynolds opened the floor for questions, she spoke. Her voice cut clean through the room. "The wind patterns in that valley are volatile," she said. The planned entry vector would pull them straight into unpredictable turbulence created by the topography. Reynolds didn't even look up from the map. He asked how many combat hours she had in that region. One of the younger pilots snorted softly, shaking his head. Ava kept her tone neutral. She didn't defend herself. She simply noted that the vector needed a 13-degree shift to avoid the worst of the updrafts. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Reynolds finally looked at her, his expression hardened. He said the approach had been tested and flown by men with real hours in combat. There was no mistaking the implication. She wasn't one of them. Her feedback to him was theory from someone who'd never flown under fire. The pilots around her relaxed, as if the question of her relevance had been settled. Mills leaned in with a grin and said his sister flew commercial too. The room chuckled like schoolboys. Ava didn't flinch. Her face gave nothing away. But deep in her eyes something shifted. Just a flicker. She returned to her notes, flipping a page slowly as if they hadn't just tried to laugh her out of the room. She knew what they didn't. She had seen what that pass could do. And she also knew this. Letting them talk themselves into disaster wasn't her style. She had tried the quiet route. Now it was time to make them listen. Sub-Part 3.2. Proof of Knowledge. Ava leaned forward slightly and tapped a specific section of the projected map. That ridgeline, she said calmly, was likely compromised. Satellite images had shown irregular movement and heat signatures consistent with mobile SAM's repositioning under camouflage netting. She mentioned magnetic interference in that area too, caused by the mineral composition of the surrounding cliffs. It wasn't theory. It was physics backed by terrain data and previous mission anomalies. The intel officer paused, clearly thrown by how precise she was, but before anyone could ask more, Reynolds chuckled and shook his head. He said he'd flown that stretch a dozen times and never had his radar blink. A few of the pilots followed his lead. One muttered about science fiction. Another asked if she read that from a training manual. Someone in the back called it Ghost Valley, like it was a punchline. Ava didn't respond to the noise. Instead, she pointed to the elevation levels of the approach corridor. If flown at the wrong angle, the updrafts combined with the interference could knock systems offline mid-flight. She detailed how those cliffs masked radar in one direction but amplified signal scatter in another, the kind of detail that only came from seeing it happen, not reading about it in a classroom. Reynolds cut her off, saying it was a combat op, not a college lecture. She kept her eyes on the map and didn't flinch. He pushed again, asking how someone with no call sign, no combat patch, and no squadron history could know any of this. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of the room. Ava said nothing at first. Then she spoke in the same even tone. Because I've flown it. More than once. There was a beat of silence. It didn't last. One of the younger pilots snorted again as if that answered everything. Her silence, her plain uniform, her lack of decor was all the proof they needed that she didn't belong. But she didn't come to belong. She came to survive. And the difference between the two was about to matter more than they knew. Part 4. Twist. The Phoenix Rises. Sub. Part 4.1. Flight Log Revelation. Ava didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or try to defend herself. She just reached into her flight suit and pulled out a small, weathered logbook wrapped in soft, worn leather. She stood, walked to the front of the room and laid it on the table in front of Reynolds. The leather creaked softly as she opened it to the first page, revealing a military ID with a photo that matched her face exactly. The name read Captain Ava Lawson, but underneath, printed in classified ink and lined with stamps, few in the room had clearance to read, was her call sign. Phoenix. No one moved. No one said a word. Reynolds glanced down and something in his face changed. Ava turned the pages slowly. Each one documented missions that didn't exist on any public record. Most entries were heavily redacted, but the locations that remained told their own story. Blacklight, Iron Halo, Shadowgate. Photographs began to fall from the back pages, grainy snapshots of Ava beside Special Forces Team's aircraft with no known designation medals awarded in rooms without cameras. She stated her flight hours, over 3,000 in live combat, across 4 aircraft types through weather and terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. She flipped to the mission logs from the Widowmaker. She had flown that pass not once but 3 separate times. Each entry cold and factual. Altitude, terrain, pressure, threat proximity. She recited the names of pilots lost on other attempts. The room had fallen utterly silent. The smirks were gone. Mills sat rigid, his face drained of color. Carter swallowed hard, staring at the floor. Reynolds didn't speak. He just looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as a transfer, not as a woman, as a survivor of something he barely understood. She closed the logbook and slid it back under her arm. Then she looked up and said nothing more. Because there was nothing else that needed to be said. Subpart 4.2. New Order. The door opened again, this time with the unmistakable sound of command boots on metal flooring. Admiral Stone stepped in without preamble, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Every pilot stood at once, posture straight, eyes forward. At ease, he said, but his gaze went straight to Ava. He nodded once, like an old agreement had finally been honored. Then he turned to Reynolds and spoke with finality. Captain Lawson will assume tactical command for Operation Shadowfall. You'll serve as her second. It was not a suggestion. Reynolds blinked but said nothing. The shift hit the room like a wave, slow but impossible to stop. Eyes moved from Ava to Reynolds, then back again. The pilots weren't sure what to do, but instinct told them to follow the strongest presence in the room. And it was no longer Reynolds. It was the woman who had flown the Widowmaker and lived to tell no one. Mills stood jaw tight and addressed her directly. He apologized, offered his position on the tactical team to her. It wasn't just about duty anymore. It was respect, the kind earned with silence and scars. Ava accepted with a nod, not gloating, not angry. She simply stepped to the front of the room and started redrawing the mission plan. Her hand moved swiftly, marking new routes, adjusting vectors, circling risks. The men watched in silence, not because they were ordered to, because they believed her now. And because she had already flown the mission they hadn't even begun. Part 5. Into the Widowmaker. Sub. Part 5.1. The flight begins. Engines roared across the deck as dawn broke over the horizon, washing the carrier in pale orange light. The FA-18s lined up their canopies, down systems checked, pilots focused. Ava sat in the lead jet, eyes forward, hands steady on the controls. Her voice came through the comms with calm authority. Formation tighten. Prepare for launch. One by one, the aircraft peeled off the deck, climbing into the sky in perfect rhythm. From above, the ocean looked flat and endless, but ahead the coastline rose into jagged mountains and valleys filled with hidden threats. Ava kept the formation tight, each move precise, her breathing even. The radar lit up within minutes. Hostile scan sweeps blinked on her console, followed by signal locks flickering in and out. She didn't panic. She adjusted altitude by 10 feet and changed heading just 2 degrees. The threats vanished from the screen. Reynolds and Mills flew off her wings, following her lead without hesitation. They could see it now. Every twitch of her aircraft had purpose. Every move predicted what came next. Crosswinds struck hard as they neared the valley. The wind wasn't just strong. It was shifting, chaotic, pulling the fighters in different directions. Ava adjusted speed, tilted her angle, and the turbulence smoothed beneath her. She radioed quick corrections, short bursts, just enough to guide. Hold your vector. Trust the terrain. Her voice was unshaken, and the others followed. Inside her cockpit, she barely blinked. Her eyes tracked shadow patterns across the mountains. She was reading the air like a map only she could see. The valley entrance appeared ahead, narrow and sharp, like the jaws of something waiting. The first burst of interference hit the radar again. One of the pilots behind her lost his signal for a second. Ava called a minor course shift that brought the aircraft back into safe range. No drama, no flare, just precision. Then came the first missile alert. A SAM system had locked onto their trail. Ava banked hard left, diving low into a crease between 2 cliffs. The radar lost them instantly, unable to track through the iron-rich rock. They popped back out into clean air missiles never fired. Not a scratch, not a scream. Just silence and awe in the cockpit comms. Reynolds finally spoke. Just 2 words. Good call. Ava didn't answer. She was already scanning the next bend. The terrain closed around them. The valley deepened. The real test was coming. But from the front of the formation, Ava flew like she had done this in her sleep. Because she had. And the mountain remembered her. Part 5.2. Trust the mountain. The Widowmaker loomed ahead, its walls narrowing into a jagged corridor barely wider than their wingspan. It was the kind of place that punished hesitation, where every gust of wind felt like a challenge and every shadow might hide a threat. Ava dropped her altitude another 5 feet, guiding the squadron into the teeth of it. The turbulence hit harder here. It came from all sides, unpredictable and sharp. One of the newer pilots gripped his controls tight, but Ava's voice kept the team steady. Hold formation. Let the wind tell you what it needs. She adjusted her angle again, reading the pressure shifts through the way her aircraft pulled, the way the metal responded. The instruments began to flicker. The interference was real. Readouts blinked and scrambled, confused by the valley's magnetic fields. Ava kept flying. She didn't look at the numbers. She flew by memory, by feel. Her hands made subtle corrections, shifting weight and trim, turning reaction into rhythm. A flash of memory hit her like the turbulence. The last time she flew this pass. The smoke. The alarms. The moment the engine flamed out mid-turn. The mountain had claimed 2 other jets that day. She remembered the crunch of metal as she hit the ridge, the heat, the way fire found her before she could even unbuckle. She had crawled from the wreckage, hands burned, comms, fried ribs cracked from impact. 3 days, alone, in the valley. No signal, no food, just the sound of wind and the metal groan of a dying aircraft. She had rebuilt the radio with parts meant for diagnostics, not rescue. That memory lived in her body now, not as fear, but as instinct. Every inch of this pass had been carved into her bones. Ahead, the narrowest point waited. It was barely wide enough for 1 jet, let alone a full squadron in formation. Ava radioed instructions. Break into staggered lead. Follow my mark. Eyes forward. No chatter. They followed without hesitation, not just because she was in charge, because they trusted her. The Widowmaker didn't forgive second chances, but Ava wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was flying with the mountain, not against it. She shifted her speed down a few knots. The jet wavered, then locked into the slipstream perfectly. Behind her, Reynolds mirrored the move. The wind twisted through the gap, but Ava had already anticipated it. She dipped, banked, then rose, gently threading through like the air was carrying her by hand. Each pilot behind her passed through with a breath held in their chest. One by one, no damage, no panic, just awe. Then the walls opened. The pass widened. They were through. Ahead, the extraction point waited. A small plateau barely visible from the sky. 3 figures stood clustered near a signal flare, exactly where Intel said they'd be. Ava broke radio silence. Extraction team prepare to land. Defense set perimeter. Let's bring them home. The jets fanned out with practiced grace. The valley behind them rumbled with leftover winds, but it no longer mattered. They had made it through the Widowmaker, and no one doubted who made that possible. Ava Lawson, Phoenix, the pilot who trusted the mountain and lived to lead others through it. The carrier deck shimmered in the afternoon sun as the jets returned one after another, wheels kissing steel with practiced grace. Ava's plane was the last to land, her touch smooth, deliberate, like every inch of the flight had gone exactly as planned. The moment her canopy opened the deck, crew paused, their nods slower, more deliberate. She climbed down, helmet tucked under her arm, eyes scanning the activity without urgency. Everything around her moved fast, but she didn't. She walked with the calm of someone who had already proven everything that mattered. Reynolds was waiting near the hangar doors, helmet in hand, posture stiff, but not cold. He didn't speak right away. He looked at her like a man seeing past the silence for the first time. He offered his hand. No speech, no apology, just a gesture. Ava took it without hesitation. Their grip was firm, mutual. Around them, the pilots who had laughed that morning now stood in a loose semicircle watching. No one smirked. No one turned away. They nodded as she passed, not out of habit, but out of recognition. Admiral Stone stepped forward from the shadows of the tower. He didn't ask for a report. He already knew. He told her the Navy wanted her to stay, that her assignment, once temporary, was now open for longer command if she chose. The offer was simple. So was her answer. She said yes. The squadron didn't cheer. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter. It was the kind of respect that didn't need to be loud. Reynolds smiled then for real. A rare thing. He said they would be better with her here. And this time, no one disagreed. Ava nodded once and turned back toward the flight deck. Her patch now bore a phoenix beneath the Jolly Roger's skull. The new mark of a leader no one questioned anymore. The last checks were quiet. The roar of engines had faded, and now only the clatter of tools and distant orders filled the air. Ava stood by her aircraft, running one final inspection, fingers brushing lightly over the patch sewn hours earlier. A young technician approached, slowly, nervous but determined. She was barely out of training, eyes wide, grease on her collar, her hair tied back in a rush. She stopped just short of speaking, then finally asked if she could say something. Ava looked up, nodded once, and waited. The girl said today meant something, that seeing Ava lead the squadron changed how she saw her own future, that it made her believe she could do more. Ava didn't smile right away. She studied the young woman, seeing the fire and doubt mixing behind her words. Then she said, "It's not about being noticed. It's about doing the job so well that no one ever has to ask who you are." The technician blinked, then nodded quickly, almost like she had been given permission to keep going. Ava added one last thought, that the mountain doesn't care what patch is on your chest. It only respects those who fly with it, not against it. The girl left with something new in her walk, not pride, purpose. Ava turned back to the jet, her hands steady again. Later, as the sun began to set, Reynolds walked by and gave a small nod. A few other pilots followed, each one more quiet than the last. There were no big gestures, just respect finally spoken in silence. Ava stayed a moment longer after everyone else had gone. She didn't need their praise. She didn't even need their approval. But she accepted their trust. She looked out at the sea, then up at the open sky. Then she whispered to no one in particular. The sky doesn't care what you've done. It only asks that you show up ready. And that was enough. Always had been.